So my name is Sudeep Chandra. I'm a professor and a researcher at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I also direct the university's Global Water Center and Osmond Institute for Global Studies. I'm really delighted and thankful that you joined us here today for an exciting event in the first of what we hope will be many collaborations between the University of Nevada, Lake Tahoe, our counterparts at UC Davis, and the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. Bringing Dr. Hayhoe's expertise here into our basin is really reflective of the priorities all of our organizations have related to sustaining this wonderful gem we have here in the Sierra, Lake Tahoe, and the communities that live here. I want to thank the Lake Tahoe Visitors Authority for bringing our speaker here today to our region through an Operation Sierra Storm television conference that's happening in South Lake Tahoe later this week. This event would not have been possible without their support. And really, thanks to Dr. Hayhoe for offering one more place to give a seminar here on North Shore. I've conducted research here in the basin for the better part of my career, and really there's some interesting intersections on how we might sustain this wonderful resource, but sustaining it in relation to a future climate that may be very different than we have had in the past, I think is one of our utmost priorities. And the science that we conduct here between UC Davis and University of Nevada at Lake Tahoe reflects that. And so thank you for coming here. Really excited about this talk. I'd like to invite my colleagues, Dr. Alex Forrest and Heather Segali from UC Davis, to come up and transitions.
All right. Thank you, Steve. I'm Alex Forrest, and I'm the interim director at the Tahoe Environmental Research Center, or TERC, where you're now sitting. And TERC established the Tahoe Science Center in 2006, and the goal was to provide science-based information. To foster responsible action and stewardship, and also to inspire an interest in environmental sciences and to motivate action to preserve freshwater resources. However, TERC is part of a much broader UC Davis legacy, as we've been conducting research in Lake Tahoe for over 6 decades. And following the footsteps of Charles Goldman, who's sitting here in the audience today, who took some of the first measurements here many decades ago, and remaining focused on climate change research and solutions. With constant innovation and new research initiatives, we can tackle emerging problems both here at Lake Tahoe and worldwide. And so we welcome you to explore our Tahoe Science Center just outside after this morning's presentation to learn more about what we do here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather Segali.
All right, thank you all for coming. I just wanted to say thank you to all of the staff that did the excellent work to make this happen. And so thank you. It is my special pleasure to introduce our guest today. Katharine Hayhoe is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. She is a Horn Distinguished Professor and Endowed Professor of Public Policy and Public Law at Texas Tech University. She is the lead author of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th National Climate Assessment. Her work has resulted in over 125 peer-reviewed papers, abstracts, and other publications. Her best-selling book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, is available for purchase outside at the end of this presentation. And so without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just realized that in all the setup, we forgot something important, which is we should probably plug the computer in just in case. Learned that one the hard way. So if you don't mind, thank you. Move over to where people can see me. All right, because there's people online, the little camera's right here, and then there's everybody else in the room also. And I'm really delighted to be with you here today because, as you know, I'm a climate scientist. But the reasons why we care about climate change often have to do more with what's in our heart than what's in our heads. And I am a lake person. I grew up on a lake far away from here, but surrounded by granite and pine trees in Ontario. And I love the lake, and I can see our lake changing. It is not the same as it used to be when I was young. And so we were just speaking earlier about all the changes that are happening here in the lake. And if you've been here for years, even just a few years, if you've been here for decades, you've definitely seen how this lake is changing too. And it feels like a place, almost a person that you love is changing in front of your eyes. And not necessarily because it wants to, but because of what's happening to it. So I specifically study what's happening at the local scale. And the very first study that I ever did that included this area was back in 2003. I know that was a really long time ago, 20 years ago. I got together with a group of scientists, primarily from California, and we looked at what would happen to the state of California. I'm sorry to say we did stop at the border, but it included all the Sierra Nevada mountains on the west side of Tahoe. We asked the question, what would happen if we continue on our current pathway of getting most of our energy from fossil fuels versus what would happen if we transitioned off fossil fuels to clean energy? And that study that was published 20 years ago was the first study for the US to document the impact of human choices on our future. Up until then, all the assessments had just said, well, middle of the road, this is what's going to happen. But our future is literally in our hands, and we need to know what the difference in our choices will make. And that study ended up being so influential that it was quoted in the governor's executive order, making California the first state in the nation to have mandatory greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. Yes. Since then, though, there's a lot to be done. And so even though I still study the regional impacts of climate change, that is not what I'm going to be speaking with you here today about. Why not? Well, number one, because you have so many experts already here who know more than I do specifically about how climate change is affecting the lake, the clarity of the lake, the species in the lake, the amount of snow that falls, how the ratio of snow to rain is changing, how the hydrology is changing, how fire risk is changing. The experts are here, and you have them speaking to you. In fact, after me next month, I think you have Mike Dettinger, who is one of the people who worked with me on that California study 20 years ago. He's a top expert in Western snowpack. So I'm not going to talk to you about what people here know more about than I do. I'm going to talk to you about something that it's been 20 years for me in sort of putting together the pieces on how do we actually affect change? Because you could have the best science in the world, you could have the best data in the world, you could have the best models in the world, but if people don't understand why it matters and what they can do about it, what's going to happen? Nothing. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. But this is part of a conversation. So if you don't mind, you can go ahead and take out your phones. If you're on the computer, you can type in polev.com/Katharine in your browser. And when you go there, it might ask you your name. You can just push skip. I don't need your name. And I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can ask me some questions this way too. So if you're online, you can do this too. Same thing. And everybody here in the room, you can do it too. Any more phones? I see a few more phones still up.
Is there Wi-Fi? There's no internet.
Oh.
You have to join UNR and it takes about 5 minutes.
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
You can actually join the UC Davis internet. So it's under UC Davis and the password is just UC Davis TERC. All one word. All one word, all lowercase.
Okay.
So that'll be fast, I think.
UC Davis.
TERC.
Yeah.
Stands for Tahoe.
Okay.
You'll see the UC Davis or TERC Wi-Fi. Everybody got that? UC Davis TERC, all lowercase. All together. Got it? Yep. Okay.
Okay, good. All right. So when you get there, you will see a question. And my first question is, I just want to know who you are. Are you a student, faculty and staff, a retired professional? I know we have a number of you here. Do you work in the public sector, in the private sector? Are you a community member? Or are you watching online? So let's see, we should be seeing results here already. Are you seeing let's see. I'm already connected to the internet. Just a second here.
Go back to the QR.
Yes, I can definitely go back to the QR code. There you go.
Yeah. It's working.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. And, all right. Well, the strange thing though is it's not showing for me on the screen, and it should be. So it should be showing your results. So let's try this again. So play from here. Okay. Start present. There we go. Okay. There, got it. Everything was being a little temperamental today, but now we're working. Okay. So it looks like we have 26%, so about a quarter faculty and staff, 20% students, 8% retired professionals in the public sector, the private sector, community members, and watching online. Excellent. Okay. So now I want to ask you another question. And this question is going to be a little bit harder. We're sort of ramping things up. This next question you have to answer with a word. Only one word, any word, but only one. All right. The next question I have for you is this. What is your favorite thing about Tahoe? I know this is hard. I know one word is a little difficult, but what is your favorite thing about Tahoe? You see why this had to be one word. It's because it's a wordle, and the more people who answer word, the bigger the word. I love this. Isn't this gorgeous? I mean, this is like the perfect ad for Tahoe, except you don't probably want more people coming, right? But that is amazing. Beauty, nature, skiing, trees, lake, forest, trees, yes, kayaking outdoors, golf, sunset, scenery. That's beautiful. All right. Now I have another question for you. And my next question for you is this. What is your area of work, or your study, or your interest? I want to know. There's a lot of knowledgeable people here in this room. So what do you study? What do you work on? What are you interested in? And unfortunately, it has to be one word again. But you're doing very well. You've totally got the hang of this. Okay, so we have a lot of people in the room who know a lot about environment, ecology, biology, water, and ecology. Good. Conservation, landscape. We also have people, oh, great, people who do journalism and music, ornithology, geology, mining, justice, finance. Excellent. This is a great variety. Isn't this fun? This is you. This is who's in the room. Perfect. All right. Now, one last question for you. I know it's hard because waiting for all the extra answers. One last question for you, which is this, and this one's a serious question. When I say climate change, how do you feel? When you hear a new report about climate change, how do you feel? So I first asked people this question 2 years ago. I had just written my book, Saving Us, and I'd written my book in response to the #1 question that I get, which is what gives you hope? So I was speaking to a group of women at a science museum, and I thought, well, why don't I ask them how they feel? I'm just making assumptions. Why don't I ask? So I asked them how they feel, and if I showed you the answers they gave me 2 years ago, a group of women and mothers at a science museum, it looks so close to what you have here that I don't think you could tell the difference. And in fact, since then, I've asked this exact question of healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses. I've asked scientists like me who study climate change. I've asked high school students. I've asked architects. I've asked Catholic nuns. And being a scientist, I've analyzed the results. And there is no statistically significant difference between any of the groups. This is how we feel. So if this is the way that you feel, and I have to say yikes shows up more often than you think. If this is the way you feel, what I want to tell you is that you should feel this way. It is not some type of mental condition. In fact, the American Psychological Association was recently discussing whether climate anxiety or climate grief, whether this should be considered a mental condition. They said no, because it is a rational response to what is happening. So if this is the way you feel, that means that you know what's happening. And what is happening is, as far back as we can look in the history of this planet, we have never seen climate changing this fast. We know that there's been natural cycles and volcanoes and changes in energy from the sun. But as far back as we can go, and the closest analogy to today is 55 million years ago, our best estimate is that 1/10 the carbon was going into the atmosphere back then, at the most recent time of warming that we can study in the paleoclimate record, 1/10 the amount of carbon compared to what we're producing today. That's pretty serious. And so the latest IPCC report that came out 2 years ago, it showed that indeed, if you look at global temperatures, you can see that over the course of the last couple of 1,000 years, our global temperature has been as stable as that of the human body. Have you ever tracked your temperature over the course of a day? It goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree over a day. That's normal. Over the course of human civilization, we can take this back 8,000 years. Our global average temperature has gone up and down by a few tenths of a degree Celsius. That's normal. But what's happening now is it is rising faster than any time we've seen, and that is why this matters. Has the planet been warmer than today before in the past? Yes. Have there been 8 billion people on the planet at that time? No. That is the point, and that is why this is so worrisome. Now, if you read the news, you know that a couple of weeks ago, it was officially announced that 2023 was the warmest year on record. On record means in terms of human records. It also broke thousands of other records for heat. And it wasn't only about the heat. If you looked at what was happening, there were record floods, there was record wildfire, there was record rainfall, record-breaking storms. Wherever you look around the world, records were being broken in terms of extreme weather affecting real people today. So you know what that looks like because you've seen changes right here, right? What are the extremes you've seen here? You've seen wildfire. How many people were here during that fire? Enough. You've seen that snowpack is going down long term, but what's also happening is variability is increasing. Last year, that was variability. So what that means is it's harder to plan. It's feast or famine. You can't count on a consistent base. Sometimes you might have more than you need. Other times you won't have enough. You know that in the lake, there's all kinds of things happening. There's algae blooms. Harmful algae blooms have been happening for the first time recently in the lake. You know that the invasive species in the lake, some introduced accidentally, some introduced on purpose, have been changing the composition of the lake. We know that wherever we are, we're seeing these changes. And so rather than referring to this as global warming, which is the increase in the long-term average of the planet, what I like, or average temperature of the planet, what I like to call it is global weirding. Because wherever you live, whoever you talk to, they might not be on board with climate change, but they'll agree that something is getting weird. I first thought about it this way when I was standing in line to pick up my son from Sunday school a number of years ago. And we were just waiting. Sunday school was going a little long. And the man behind me said, "Do you mind if I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure. I mean, we're standing in line here. It's not like I'm going anywhere." And he said, "Do you feel like our weather is getting weirder?" And this is in West Texas, in Lubbock, the second most conservative city in the entire country, where when you have an election, there's a Republican candidate, and then there's the conservative Republican candidate who runs against him. I said him. So he said, "Do you feel like the weather's getting weirder?" And I thought about it, and I thought, well, that's a really good way to put it. I said, yes, I know that we're having way more days over 100 degrees. I know that our rainfall is much more variable than it used to. Our droughts are longer and stronger. Our downpours are heavier. I said, yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Our weather's getting weirder. And he said, I knew it. I've lived here for 30 years and I could tell something was different. So I just think this is a really effective way. There's no magic term that's going to make everybody get on board with this, but this is one example of an effective way to ask people about their own experiences and say, how long have you lived here? What have you noticed? Have you seen things getting weirder? What is it? Ask people to tell you their story rather than you telling them yours. The way I think about it is as if we have a pair of weather dice. So wherever we live, we have a pair of weather dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. Heat wave, a drought, a flood, a storm, a wildfire. But as the world gets warmer decade by decade, what's happening? It's like it's sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and turning it into another six, taking another number and turning it into a six. It's even putting a 7 or sometimes an 8 on our dice. So we're rolling these dice, so to speak, every year, and we can still end up with a 1 or a 2 sometimes, but we're starting to see 6 after 7 after 8, and we're like, where did this come from? That's global weirding. So we see this in all of our different extremes. We see that we've always had droughts, but as the world gets warmer, they're getting stronger and longer. We have always had heat waves, but as the world gets warmer, the heat waves are more frequent and more dangerous. We have always had tropical storms, but they're powered by warm ocean water. So the warmer the ocean, the stronger the storm, and the more water it dumps. And this is true for atmospheric rivers as well, which is what you get right here. And then with wildfires, where do humans come in? And where does climate change come in? Well, in the lower 48 states, the majority of wildfires are the result of what? Accidental human ignition. And in some cases, I think the stats for California are 7% arson. And we know with the Calder fire that that was the case, right? So where does climate change come in then? Climate change doesn't start the fire. But imagine if you accidentally dropped a match into a pile of green, wet wood. What would happen? Not much. And then imagine that you drop that same match into a pile of bone-dry kindling that's been baking in the sun with no rain and unusual heat for weeks. What happens? That's climate change. And it's exacerbated in this part of the world by the fact that beetles are overwintering because winter isn't cold enough to kill them off. So you've got beetles eating trees, and you can see them around the lake as we were discussing. And so you've got these stands of dead trees now too. So when that match gets dropped accidentally, so to speak, you've got all of that dead brush for it to burn as well. So this is actually a data set from NOAA showing the change in the number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters over time. It is adjusted for the value of the dollar changing over time, of course, but it is not adjusted for how the value of our infrastructure is changing over the time. So obviously, the more infrastructure we have, the greater the risks. And if you look at this, let me parse this out for you because there's a very interesting statistic. In the US, back in the 1980s, we had about 3 of these a year. 1 every 4 months. By the 2010s, we were having 1 every 2.8 weeks. Huge difference. This past year, we broke a record, 28 events in a single year. That's 1 every 1.9 weeks. So this is happening and it is affecting us. And the latest in the area of science, and you actually have a scientist, Michael Weiner, who's one of my colleagues from Lawrence Berkeley Labs, who is also a Tahoe resident. And Michael and others study attribution. So what scientists can do now is we can actually put a number on just how much worse climate change made a specific event. Now, 10 years ago, if you said, how did climate change contribute to that wildfire? We'd have to say, well, we can't attribute any single event to human-caused climate change, but we know over climate timescales of 20 to 30 years that we see this trend. Not anymore. We can actually put numbers now on how much more likely climate change made a specific event. So the deadly floods in Germany 2 years ago, 9 times more likely. Do you remember the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 and the wildfires that happened there? At least 150 times more likely. Talk about loading the dice against us. I live in Texas, where the rains from Hurricane Harvey were 3 times more likely, and work by Michael Weiner showed that 3/4 of the economic damages would not have occurred if climate change hadn't supersized that hurricane, as you can see here. So, oops, there we go. And then there's one more interesting study that just came out last May. I'm not sure if you saw this. It was a study led by the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they found that 37% of the area burned across Western North America since 1980 could be attributed to 80 corporations' carbon emissions. Isn't that mind-blowing? That is how precisely scientists can calculate the impact we humans are having on the world that we live in right here. Why do we care about this? We care about it because it is literally affecting the air we breathe. You know what that looks like, right? When there's wildfires. It's affecting the water we drink. It's affecting the food that we eat. It affects the buildings and the roads and the systems we use that were designed for a planet that no longer exists. It affects the nature that surrounds us. But this isn't about saving the planet. And this phrase is so endemic that I actually have to take it out often when people put it into my talk titles or my bios or something. It isn't about saving the planet. Why am I saying that? It's because if we talk about saving the planet, we set up this conflict between people versus the planet, or the economy versus the environment. Does the planet need us? No, it will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. In fact, let's be honest, the planet might be better off without us, right? The planet does not need us, we need it. Where does the air you breathe come from? Half of the oxygen comes from tiny phytoplankton in the ocean. Where does the food you eat come from? It all comes from this planet. We cannot survive without the planet. And so that's why when I talk about this issue, I want to be very clear. It's about saving us. And I have an asterisk on the us because I want to emphasize it is not just about us humans. Our life depends on nature. If all of nature were removed from the planet, leaving humans alone, what would happen to us? It'd be all over for us. If we were removed from the planet, leaving all of nature behind, what would happen to them? I think they'd be fine. So again, this really is about life on this planet, about the profound impact that we as humans have had on what? On our home, the only home we have. And why is this important? It's important because what this means is that we are all the perfect people to care. So we've talked about why we're worried. And I've shown you how every worry that you have is completely justified. But here's the challenge we have. We're not moving fast enough. Climate action is not moving fast enough. And so every time I went on social media this summer, every time there was a new disaster, I saw someone saying, if this isn't enough, nothing is. If the Hawaii wildfires aren't enough, nothing is. If the Canadian wildfires, if the Canary Islands wildfires, if the Greek wildfires, if the floods in the Northeast, if the bathtub temperature water off the coast of Florida isn't enough, nothing is. People kept saying again and again, if this isn't enough, nothing is. Well, we are seeing mounting disasters, yet we're not seeing the action and response that we would assume. Why is that? We often feel like, well, here's me and everyone I know. I was pretty confident about this crowd. So I figured ahead of time we were probably mostly all going to be in the blue there. So here's me and everybody I know, everybody in this room, we're in the blue. But then here's all these other people who don't want to talk about it and don't want to do anything about it, right? So let me ask you, if you don't mind taking your phones back out again, I have a question for you. Now, bear in mind that this is anonymous, there's no grades given, but there is a right answer and a wrong answer to this. I'm just curious, I want to ask you, how many people, what percent of people in Nevada are worried about climate change. A new poll from the Yale Program on Climate Communication came out this morning, and I am quoting their data in this figure. How many people in Nevada are worried about climate change? On a poll, anonymous poll. All right. Interesting. Okay, so what we have is let's see, about 55% of you are going with less than 50%. So half of you think that less than 50% are worried, right? And then, no, more than half of you, 60% of you think that less than 50% are worried. And then we've got someone very optimistic here. I wish that were the case. Unfortunately, it is not. I'll go ahead and tell you that. All right. So the correct answer here is E. Yes, but I got a little sneaky. You know what F is? F is the correct answer for California. Yeah. But here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is that we often, and here's the actual data. I pulled up Washoe County. So here's the actual data that just came out this morning, if you're interested. This is a map of the whole US by county. And so you can see that it varies, but you can see that, you know, some surprising areas of Texas are pretty orange, right? You can go there to the Yale Program on Climate Communications website, and you can actually dig into each congressional district and each county if you're interested. And this is the global data from 2 years ago. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. The gray was not measured, by the way. Okay, so here's the thing. We often think that people look like this. And I didn't know what you were going to say, but your survey results actually bore this out. The majority of you, 60% of you, put this category as bigger than that category. 60% of you said the orange was bigger than the blue. But as you just saw, it's actually more like this. So according to the Yale Program on Climate Communication, about 2/3 of people are worried. But do you know how many people are activated? 8%. 8% are activated. So let me ask you a question. Is it more important to move people who are not worried into the worried group, or to move people who are worried into the activated group? Exactly. It is more, we could have the entire world worried. The whole world could be worried. But if they don't know what to do and they're not activated, what's going to happen? Nothing, except we're going to be more miserable with nothing. You might as well not be worried if you don't know what to do about it. You know, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die, right? So this is really important because 99% of the communication that I see on climate change is focused on moving this group into this category. And at the beginning, that was important because if you look back 30 or 40 years ago, this was the biggest category. But today it is no longer the biggest category. This is the biggest category. And the way to move people from not worried to worried is very different than how you want to move people who are worried into activated. Yet today, again and again, I still see the, if this disaster isn't enough, nothing is. What does a disaster do? It moves people from this category to this category. But ironically, the more disasters that happen, the more the worry group gets stuck in worried. Could I have stopped the Hawaii wildfires? No. Could I have stopped the Canada wildfires? Absolutely not. Have you ever been to the Northwest Territories? There's no way to even get around up there. I, as an individual, feel ever more hopeless and helpless the more disasters occur. And the more people tell me about the disasters, the worse it gets. The interesting thing is that this is actually what neuroscience tells us about the way our brains work. So climate changes and we get worried, and 9 times out of 10, what do? We load up on all the accurate, truthful, scary facts that we have, and we have a lot of them, and we share them with people. But then we don't see the changes that we want. We just see people being like, oh, we've already talked about that. Or, oh, here she goes again. Or, oh, well, there's nothing I can do anyways. And inaction results. Why is that? Well, it turns out that this is the way our brains are wired. There's a neuroscientist named Tali Sharot who wrote a great book called The Influential Mind. I finally got the chance to meet her in person just last week. And I told her how much it meant to me because she wasn't writing a book about climate change. She was simply writing a book about the human brain. When I read books, though, nonfiction books, I read them with a highlighter in hand. And I have to say, her book was more orange than not. That was how much relevant information there was to climate change in a book that didn't even mention climate change. I think she might have mentioned it once as an example. One of the things she said that really struck me was that fear and anxiety cause our brains to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And she is talking about the way our brains are wired. So our brains are wired to run away from an immediate threat like the bear. But if you're coping with this long-term threat over years to decades, we are not built to cope with that. Our response is to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And is that not a good summary of a lot of the state of the world today? And so climate change is more. What do we have to do to overcome this threshold, this barrier? We have to understand that loading up on scary facts is not what most people need. If they're in the blue category, do they need more scary facts? No, in fact, I would argue they need less. What we need is we need 2 important things I think of as the heart and the hands. So all of the scary and very true factual information about climate change that I study as a scientist, I think of that as the head. The data, the facts, the hottest year on record, the ice sheets melting, the sea level rising, all of that is the head. How do we connect the head to the heart? Why it matters to me as a human, the places I love, the people I love, the things I love. And then how do I connect my heart to my hands? What can I do to fix it? So these 2 concepts actually have names in psychology. The first one is called psychological distance. And it is something that we are all prone to. We think of risks as being far off and distant. I know we're supposed to stand up every 30 minutes, but ooh, how long have we been sitting here? I know that I'm supposed to save this much for retirement. I know I'm not supposed to eat that extra cupcake, or I know I'm, but that's gonna, it won't affect me until later. We'll take care of it later. We do this all the time. Or we say, well, it just affects those people over there. It's not about me. Or, it doesn't really matter to what I care about. It just matters to what those people care about. Well, when it comes to climate change, we see every single one of these in play. And let me show you the data. So this is the same Yale survey that I just showed you. This is, again, brand new from this morning. I had the older maps from 2 years ago until yesterday. So the weather forecasters, the broadcast meteorologists got the old maps yesterday. And you're getting the new ones this morning. Do you think climate change will harm plants and animals? Where's the psychological distance here? In terms of relevance, these are non-human species. People say, sure, plants and animals, yes. Will climate change harm future generations? Where's the psychological distance here? In the future? Yeah, sure. How about people who live over there? Distant in space. Yeah, it'll affect people who live over there. And then the researchers asked people this question, and I was frankly appalled to see that these survey results had not significantly changed in 2 years. Will it affect you? Yes, I know. I pulled out this county so you can see that number there. 47%, which is above the national average by 1%. Yeah, I wouldn't be saying that. That means the good news is, I'm a glass half full person, you have a lot of room to improve. And when the survey comes out again, you now know that you could actually make a difference in the color. So some people might ask, well, why are certain areas already lightly orange? this is a bit of a detour, I'll just let you know. The two most concerned people groups in the US about climate change are Hispanic Catholics and Native Americans. Now you might say, of course, the Pope's encyclical, right? And the Pope wrote a new encyclical this past year called Laudato Deum. It is just 9 pages long. And I thought my phone was going to burst into flames when I was reading that thing. He minced no words whatsoever. But you know what? White Catholics and white evangelical Protestants are right at the bottom of the list of the least concerned. Or I should say the top of the list of the least concerned. Right. So anyway, that's a little detour as to why there's certain areas that are yellow. So this shows us that the number one thing, the first thing we have to do to help connect our head to our heart is we have to talk about what is happening now, what is happening here, what is happening in concrete ways that you can see and touch, maybe even smell, and in ways that are relevant to people's lives. And you know what? You can do that here at Tahoe, can't you? You can talk about what is happening right now. You can talk about what is happening right here. You can talk about things that people can see in the lake and the mountains around Tahoe, and you can talk about why it matters to you. If you are a skier or a snowboarder, if you are someone who enjoys the lake, if you live along the lake, if you live in the forest, if you're worried about wildfire, you can connect the head to the heart. So that's step number one. But step number two is really important. If we were worried and we don't know what to do about it, we'll do nothing. So here's the thing. People want solutions that give us something better than what we have today. And unfortunately, a lot of climate solutions are couched in terms of loss. Because a lot of people, and some of us right here in this room, we are attracted to causes that cause us to sacrifice for them. Sacrifice for many of us, that gives us that feeling of identity and self-worth that we want. And sacrifice is a good thing. I certainly grew up in a religious tradition where sacrifice was part of what we were taught. But here's the problem. Most people are not going to respond to that. And so I literally have people saying, well, if you don't tell people that they have to stop, you have to stop everything. You have to stop driving, traveling, eating, having children. You have to stop everything. Come join me. You get the picture, right? Now, if that makes you happy, more power to you, and thank you for everything you do. I want to be clear on that. But I also want to be clear on the fact that most people want a better life. When the new iPhone comes out, there's 200 people lined up to get it. Why? Because it's worse and they have to sacrifice? No, it's because it's going to give them a better life. So it's really important when we're talking about solutions, and I truly believe we can do this, to talk about solutions that save us money, increase the quality of our life, give us more time to spend with each other and with family or in nature, improve the place that we love, that we all live together, make us healthier. Oh, and they fix climate change too. These are the types of solutions we need to be talking about, and they're abundant. The second piece is that people are willing to change if they feel what they do can make a difference. And today, most people would say no. 50% of people in the US feel helpless and hopeless and don't know what to do when it comes to climate change. 50%. Why? Because I might have changed my light bulbs, drive an EV, eat a plant-based diet, and then I hear that, during the pandemic, they were flying 3,000 empty flights just to keep their gate assignments. How do my actions matter? So as a scientist, when people started to ask me, what should I do? I said, step on the carbon scales, measure your carbon footprint, take actions to reduce your emissions. And I did it myself. In fact, I discovered, much to my horror, about 15 years ago, that the biggest part of my personal carbon footprint was flying to scientific conferences and giving talks about climate change. Not going to yoga retreats in Bali. I've never been to one of those, but going to do science. So 15 years ago, I decided I need to do something about that. So this was way back before Zoom. There was no Zoom in those days. We had Skype. And I think we had something else called Join Me, and maybe one other thing that is now defunct. And so I decided I am not going to transition 80% of the talks I do to virtual talks. And a lot of people then said, well, we've never done that before. How does it work? But they were willing to try it, and so I did. And then I said, I'm only going to travel when I can assemble a sufficient critical mass of events, which is why I'm here, because I was at OSS yesterday, where I did a presentation and about 8 to 10 interviews, and then a bunch more meetings. And then today I've got this presentation, the one down South Shore this afternoon, meetings all in between, Nature Conservancy stuff as well. But I know, and because I've calculated, that even if all of us who have the resources and the knowledge to make the change, because make no mistake, these changes actually require resources and knowledge. If all of us did everything we could, that wouldn't even take care of a quarter of the problem. So that was when I realized there had to be more. And so I went back to the maps. And I asked, how can we tackle this head to heart to hands connection? And you wouldn't believe it, but the maps had the answer. It turns out that there's something that we are not doing, and I'm very sorry to say the updated maps have not changed that much. So my message hasn't changed. I was actually slightly nervous this morning because I was checking the maps. I was like, oh, what if this map changed? What am I going to say? But it hasn't, which means, again, glass half full, you have a lot of work to do. So it turns out there's something that we are not doing that is so obvious that we just skip right over it. It is so painfully obvious that we just take it for granted and we just dismiss it out of hand. What is it? Well, let me ask you this. How often do you, go ahead and take your phones back out again, or if you're on the computer, open this window again. How often do you have a conversation about climate change? And again, this is anonymous. So there you go. Somebody's brave. They answered daily, once or twice a week, once or twice a month, once in a while, or never. All right, lots of good responses coming in. You are very quick with your fingers, I have to say. This is an impressive audience. All the internet challenges and everything, you got it. Okay. So we have a solid 48% saying once or twice a week. And then we have a couple who say daily. I put myself in that category, but that's what I do. And then once or twice a month, once in a while, and never. All right, how do you stack up? You want to know? Here we go. So this is where we left off. This is the map that we're at where, do you think it will affect you personally? And then, do you ever talk about it even once in a while? Yeah, exactly. So 39% is a little bit above average. The national average is 36%. But there's a lot of room to move that number. Now, if you look globally, here's worry. And then, do you hear about it once a week? Now, why am I showing you global numbers? Because I believe, I don't have proof. As a scientist, I want to be clear, I don't have proof. But I suspect strongly that on this global map, you can see the influence of a single human being. There is one person who is very well known for starting conversations about climate change. Yep. Her name is, yep, I hear you say it. Her name is Greta. She lives in Sweden. And as a young girl, she took a piece of white cardboard and she painted a few words on it, School Strike for Climate. And she went and she sat outside a building, the Swedish Parliament. And I believe that she has changed, or I should say, I believe she has started, catalyzed a chain of reactions, because many more people picked up that challenge, I can tell you that has actually started to change the color of entire countries. Have you ever doubted that an individual can make a difference? I would say doubt no more. And how did she do it? Well, when she got worried about climate change, what did she do? She convinced her family to give up driving. They adopted a plant-based diet. They got renewable energy. But she knew at that young age that that wasn't enough. She knew that there had to be something more. Because just think about this. If you don't talk about something, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you do anything about it? Right? Pretty simple. We just take talking for granted, though. Now, I want to put in a couple of caveats here. First of all, I've often heard people say, well, I talk about it so much people are bored. You ever identify with that? Do you know anybody who fishes? How long could they talk about fishing without getting bored? But if you don't fish, how long can you listen to talk about fishing without getting bored? See my point? So if you feel like, well, I'm having these conversations, but people are bored, one reason might be because you're talking about why you care instead of why they care. So for example, imagine if you cared about climate change because you were a passionate birder, and climate change is definitely affecting birds. But imagine the person you're talking to is not a birder. Do they want to hear about how climate change is affecting birds every single day? No. But if they fish, I bet they would love to know how climate change is affecting fish. So what do we have to do? We have to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. We have to ask them questions. We have to figure out what they care about. Are they passionate about gardening, about their kids, about being out on the water, about being in the forest? What are they passionate about? And then help to connect the dots. So I actually started a newsletter last year because people were saying, well, where do I find these stories? And in my newsletter, I'll show you a QR code at the end. In my newsletter, every week I have stories about how climate change is affecting beer, or how climate change is affecting beaches, or how it's affecting soccer or tennis or golf, how it's affecting skiing, how it's affecting the food that you get, the price of food at the grocery store, how it's affecting things we care about. So don't be the person who talks about fishing to all the people who don't like fishing. We have to be the people who actually get to know the other person and figure out what they care about and help them see how who they are is the perfect person to care. Second caveat, this is something called the 6 Americas of global warming. We are not just believers or deniers when it comes to climate change. We actually fall along a spectrum. And most of us are actually over here on the alarmed, concerned, or cautious side. But there is one group that is very loud on social media. I run into them every day on social media. And they love to argue. But I truly believe that it would take a miracle to change a dismissive's mind. In fact, my personal definition of dismissive is if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone that said global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame appeared to someone who's dismissive, it would not change their mind. They would say, haven't you heard of solar cycles? So my best advice is do not run out and immediately engage the person who is the loudest about arguing, because they're not going to have a conversation with you. They're going to have an argument with you. And I'm talking about a conversation where we connect our head to our heart to our hands, not an argument where we're butting heads. So with someone who's dismissive, I typically say, I'm sorry, you're wrong, and let's talk about something else. Or if it's my relative, I love you, I'm sorry, you're wrong. Now, how about that fishing? And you never know, you might end up in a conversation where they might be telling you, well, the fish used to be like this, but now they're like this, and we're not finding the same species. And you could be nodding along going, oh, tell me more. And before they know it, they're telling you why they care. And you could say, well, you know, it's because the lake is getting warmer and people aren't taking care of the lake like they should. And before you know it, they actually find a reason to care, but not by arguing, by connecting their head to their heart. So then, lastly, a last argument people might have is, well, talking isn't enough. Well, of course it's not enough, but tell me any time when humans actually did anything together without talking, right? It's the necessary first step. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. The goal of the conversation is not to tell people about everything you know, all the reasons you care, all the reasons they're wrong, or even worse, all the reasons they're bad. Nobody wants a lecture on why they're bad and why they're wrong. The point of the conversation is to bring them in, ask them questions, figure out what they care about, help them connect the dots. This is really important because the conversations that I've witnessed are often very one-way and often very, not directly, but implicitly judgmental. And I don't know about you, but I don't really like being judged. If I feel like someone's judging me, my typical instinct is, well, I'm not going to do that in front of them anymore. But I'm just going to go do it over here, right? And I'll avoid them next time. If I see them in the grocery store, I'll just step into the other aisle. So that is not, it's going to make us feel better temporarily, but it's not going to make them change long term. To make people change, we have to help people see how who they are is the perfect person to care. And so I think about these conversations like knocking over the first domino. Now, you could knock over each domino individually, right? But how much easier is it if you knock over the first domino? That's what these conversations are like. So climate changes, we get worried. And here's where we do something different. Connect, again, the head to the heart, to the hands. Share something personal to you or to the person you're talking with about how it affects you. And positive, constructive solutions about what we can do as individuals, groups that we can join that make a difference, ways that we can help where we work or where we go to school make a difference. And what happens is people feel empowered and change results. Why? Because this is the way our brains are wired. To go back to the neuroscience, the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not with avoiding harm. So I promise you she wasn't talking about climate change here. Isn't that crazy? She says, reframe your message, whatever that is, so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. Can you do that? Now, what is hope? I'm often accused of peddling hopium. And by that, they mean, well, you're just telling everybody it's going to be fine. I'm like, excuse me, have you read my last 5 social media posts on how dreadful the world's conditions are? The world will not be fine if we don't do something about it. Hope begins by recognizing it's bad. Because do you need hope when everything's fine? No, you need hope when it's not fine. So if you're already worried, you've already got step 1 locked down. What's step 2? Step 2 is envisioning a better future that's possible. And step 3 is figuring out what's needed to get there. That is what is hope. So that is the type of hope people need. So talk. Let's get down to brass tacks here. Talk about how climate change is affecting us. People say, well, sure, but I still can't figure out how to talk about the polar bears. And my point is you don't, unless under what circumstances would you want to talk about how the polar bears are being affected? Number 1, if you're talking to a polar bear, I don't recommend. Number 2, if the person you're talking to is passionate about polar bears, right? That's when you want to talk about it. But if they're not, then what do you want to talk about? Well, when I'm in Texas, I talk about cotton. And I don't just talk about it, I ask Jack how his cotton has been doing, and Jack tells me that he hasn't had a decent crop since 2005. When my friend Joellen is talking about climate change, she tells people how she lives in Arizona and she has to wake her kids up before dawn in the summer to play outside because otherwise it's too hot. If we're talking to people who live in areas that have been flooded, we ask them how did they do? Like, were they flooded? Were people they know flooded? How are they coping with it? We can talk about nature. If people love spending time in nature, what are the changes you've seen there? What changes have you seen with snowpack? What changes have you seen that affect our lives? The bottom line is to care about climate change, you don't have to be a certain type of person, you just have to be a human. Whoever the other person or other people are, they're already the perfect person to care. And our job is not to reshape them into whoever we are. Imagine if everybody had to become a climate scientist to care about climate change. That'd be ridiculous. Our job is to show them that who they already are, the values they have, the places they love, the people they love, the things they love, it makes them the perfect person to care. That's step 1. And then step 2 is what we can do to fix it. I love telling stories about solutions. There's no single solution, but there's a lot of what I think of as silver buckshot. And the image I use to talk about solutions is kind of funny. It's a swimming pool, specifically an old school swimming pool, one of these above ground swimming pools. So imagine the level of water in the swimming pool is the level of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. And at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we stuck a giant hose in our swimming pool, and we've been turning it up every year. So the first type of solution we need is we need to turn off the hose, right? But our pool has a drain, and the drain is nature. And it turns out that nature can take up to 1/3 of our emissions out of the atmosphere. So the second thing we need to do is we need to make the drain bigger by investing in nature. But the third thing we have to do, the water in the pool is now so high that our toes can't touch the ground. We have to learn how to swim. That's adaptation and resilience. So when we talk about solutions, there are so many solutions. People often say, well, clean energy is the fastest way to turn off the hose. I'm like, well, actually, the cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. Efficiency and clean energy, changing land use and agriculture, behavioral change. And at the very bottom, we have some technologies that ultimately could help with the few last drops in the hose, but no more. There is no silver bullet, but there's so much else we can do. With making the drain bigger, people often say plant trees. But did you know that protecting existing ecosystems actually takes up more carbon? And then restoring degraded ecosystems, then yes, if there's literally nothing there, definitely plant something. Climate smart agriculture also makes the drain bigger. And at the very end, the last few drops, we have technologies like direct air capture for everything we can't already do with the amazing technology known as photosynthesis. But then lastly, we have to learn how to swim. And this looks like rebuilding our homes and our cities and our infrastructure to be resilient to climate, using technology to help make us resilient, especially working with nature to make us more resilient, and working with people to make us more resilient. The benefit, though, is that climate solutions can do a lot. They clean up our air and our water. They protect us from disasters. They help us grow more food, not less, provide energy that's more affordable, not less, reduce inequalities, make our cities safer, give us a more stable world. When I look at all these solutions, I just think, well, for goodness sakes, why not? This is the opposite of you can't do anything. Go live in a cave. Who does not want clean air to breathe? Who doesn't want clean water coming out of the tap? Who does not want abundant, healthy food? Who doesn't want thriving nature? A better world is possible, and climate change is what stands between us and that better world. So in the words of Greta, the one thing we need more than hope is action. Why? Because once we start to act, hope is everywhere. Isn't that interesting? I think of this as a cycle, an action-hope cycle. And when we share stories about how not just countries are acting, not just corporations are acting, but communities are acting, everybody from churches to army bases. And of course, right here, there's all kinds of action happening, isn't there? There's action here. There's action with all the different conservancies around the lake that are protecting the forest, protecting the water. Citizens Climate Lobby is very active in Nevada and California, engaging people for, I love the last sentence here, you can't solve climate change alone, but together we can, which I completely believe. At the Nature Conservancy, we do a lot of work in Nevada and California, looking at the financial benefits of climate action, looking at how best to protect our forests from climate change, from pests. We often think of climate action as a giant boulder with only a few people's hands on it. But when we start to share stories of everything that's happening, we realize that there's millions of hands on that giant boulder. And if you add your hand and if I add mine, it will go faster. Isn't that amazing? So what does the science say? The science says that every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. Every choice matters. Science literally says this. And so at the top of all my social media where you can pin something, I have something pinned. If you are worried about climate change and you want to make a difference, here's what the social science says, how you as an individual can be most effective. Number one, start a conversation about what? About the heart and the hands. Number two, join a climate action group. There's a lot of them around Tahoe, isn't there? To help amplify your voice. Number three, we haven't gotten to light bulbs or meat yet. Have you noticed that? This is the way that we humans can truly catalyze change. Number three, did you know that if you keep $1,000 in a savings account in a bank that invests in fossil fuels, that produces the equivalent carbon every year of a flight from New York to Seattle? I didn't even know that myself until just recently when they did that analysis. Spark ideas for change at work and school. How does a business ever change? How does a city ever change? What was the first step in a school making a change? The first step was someone opened their mouth and said, why don't we do this? And we can also, you notice there's a lot in common here. Holding politicians accountable is not only voting, it is also showing up and asking them, what are you doing about this? Or saying, well, you live here and I live here. Are you worried about this? Well, if you are, what can we do? And then here we also have, and this is important, people often ask me, do we need individual action or system-wide change? My answer is yes, right? We need to reduce our personal carbon footprint. I mean, imagine if I had flown here on a personal jet with my 12 children and I was going to be sitting down to a 2-pound steak dinner afterwards. And I give you a nice little talk on climate change, right? We have to talk the talk and walk the walk, but don't forget whatever changes you make in your life, make them contagious by talking about them. Did you know what the #1 predictor is of whether someone has solar panels? If another home within a mile has them. That's the #1 predictor. Bill McKibben has an awesome quote that I love. He says, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. Isn't that interesting? What's he talking about? He's talking about how it's not just about me, my life, my personal carbon footprint. It's more about my climate shadow, how I'm affecting people around me. And so I was thinking about this concept. And I was thinking that how do we influence people around us? Well, it all comes back to the same thing, right? Communication. So I started this newsletter. If you're interested, it's totally free. You can get it on Substack here, or if you scan this QR code, it'll take you to the newsletter via email. And every week I share good news, not so good news, and something you can do to make a difference, including talking about it. So to conclude, when the IPCC report came out, I was asked to write an essay, and I decided to write an essay about what we can do to make a difference. And I want to conclude with these words, because I think they really sum up what I've been talking about. Where do we find hope? We find it in action because if you look at our world has changed. And when it did, it was not because a big, rich, wealthy, famous person decided it had to. Change did not begin with the King of England waking up one morning and deciding, oh, I will just end slavery. That is not how it happened. The President of the United States did not wake up one morning and say, oh, maybe women should have the vote today. No, that's not how it happened. The National Party of South Africa didn't say, oh, it's Friday, let's end apartheid. That is not how it happened. Change began, massive social change at the scale needed to tackle climate change. It began when ordinary people of no particular power or wealth or fame decided the world could and should be different. So there's a few names we know: William Wilberforce, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. But who were all the countless others who shared and supported and fought for their visions of a better world? I have really important news for you. Those people were people who had the courage of their convictions, who used their voices to advocate for the systemic societal changes needed, who were not the rich, wealthy, powerful, influential people. They were us. We are the people who changed the world before, and we are the people who can change it again. So if that's the case, my last question to you is just this: what are we waiting for? You know what to do, and you know where to start. Thank you. Yes.
I'll do something after.
Oh, okay. All right. We're going to have a little time for Q&A now. And then if you're interested, I'm going to be signing books out there and you can all chat. So this is the last time you have to use your phones, and you can do this online too. People online can ask questions also. Go ahead and put your question in. It doesn't have to be one word. It could be a whole question. And here's the fun part, is you can upvote the questions you're most interested in. I have great faith in conventional wisdom, and you have never disappointed me yet. So there we go. It's a good question to begin with. Okay. So now when you see the questions, you can give them an upvote if you like the questions. Keep the questions coming. We're going to have about 10 minutes here. All right. So this question, presumes that the root cause is too many people on the planet. And a matter of fact is, the matter of fact is, did you know the richest 1% of people produce more than double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%? Most of us live using the resources of 4 planets a year. Most people in Yemen or Zimbabwe live using the resources of 1/10 of a planet a year. How many people saw the Avengers movie with the big purple guy Thanos who had the glove with the gems in it? Nobody wants to admit to it. I see a few hands. I saw it. I have a family. We watched it. The premise was that he collected all of these gems and put them in a glove so he could snap his fingers and get rid of half the population of the universe. That was the premise. Well, I have news for you. You could get rid of half of the people on this planet, all of the ones who are most affected by climate change, and that would have no impact on our overconsumption or climate change. Climate change is profoundly an issue of injustice and inequity. There is enough on this planet to go around. But did you know, I'll just give you an example, we waste almost half the food we produce. Half the food we produce gets wasted instead of eaten. We waste 67% of the energy we use through inefficiency. So when we talk about climate solutions, when we talk about population change, my answer is, it is not about telling poor women in low-income countries who do not have access to basic health care, who often live in patriarchal societies, what they can or cannot do with their bodies. It is about providing them with resources for education, for health, for food and water. An educated woman in Africa grows more food for every year of education she has, even primary education. It is about looking at the equitable distribution of resources around the world and recognizing that we all share this home together. It is a home for every single one of us. And we need to make sure that all of us have everything we need to live, but without the waste that we live with today and we take for granted. All right. So which banks don't invest in fossil fuels? Well, if you get my newsletter, you would see that 2 weeks ago, I had a link in it to Bank Green. And Bank Green has a very handy list, actually a rating system, because it's not like black or white, there's certain, more or less, as a rating system of banks around the world, not just in the US. So I went there, and I use a very small local bank in Texas, so I typed in my bank's name, and they didn't have a rating for it. So there was a little button where it said, can't find your bank, submit it here. So I did. 3 days later, they emailed me with my bank score. It was amazing. It wasn't good, so I'm going to be moving. So that's a great way. Bank Green is a great way. And that's one of the resources I always have in my newsletter. How do you handle dismissive people when they inject themselves into constructive conversations loudly and repeatedly? Yes, that has happened. So unfortunately, I have tried several thousand times. And the bad news is I have never had a constructive conversation with someone who's dismissive. I have never had a constructive conversation with someone who's truly dismissive. The best thing you can do is you can say, I'm sorry, you're wrong. Now let's talk about how, and here's actually a few tips. In Texas where I live, we have more solar and wind energy than any other state. Do you have a problem with that? Now, I also heard that China has twice the clean energy of the US. In fact, they are on track to really beat the pants off not only the US, but every other country. Are you okay with China getting that far ahead of the US? So there's some provocative questions you can ask to sort of promote the conversation. But in general, like I said, if somebody wants to argue, my answer is simply, I'm sorry you're wrong, and now let's talk about something else. Because it is not about butting heads, it is helping people connect their heads to their hearts. And so if there's something they're passionate about, like their grandchildren are fishing, I would much rather talk about that. And who knows, later on down the road, there might be the ability to make that connection. How do you get people to reduce energy use if it improves their life? Well, I think your answer is in your question. You have to show them how it improves their life. That's the answer. What is our brain wired to do? Our brain is wired to move forwards towards something that is positive, right? So the secret to getting somebody to do something is to, and this is advertising 101, convince them their life will be better with it than without it. And thankfully for climate solutions, I believe that's the truth. Any advice on how to talk about voting? Let me scale this up a little bit. This is really tough, I won't lie. So I'm Canadian. And in Canada, we have a lot of parties, which makes life slightly easier. Here, there's just two. It is so binary and so difficult, isn't it? It's like black or white, yes or no. But this election is, again, very important because, I don't know if you remember a few slides ago, every bit of warming matters. Every bit of warming. And so what happens over 4 years is not entirely up to a president. The last time that Trump was president, 65% of the companies, cities, and states in the US were in on the Paris Agreement still. So it's not, either or, it's not binary. But federal legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act has a huge role to play in spurring climate action. So elections matter, but let me tell you something interesting. Did you know that 99.5% of elected officials in the US are not federal? Isn't that crazy? I mean, I never took American history, so I could be excused for not knowing it. But what does that mean? It means that there's a lot more people being elected for a lot more positions who are a lot more available for conversations than congressional representatives or senators. And did you know that at the city to state level, climate action happens exponentially faster than at the federal level? At the federal level, it's sort of the last to get on the train. So do not neglect your local elections. Do not neglect your regional elections. In Texas, one of the most powerful positions is the railroad commissioner. Yes, that's the person who regulates all the flaring of methane from the oil fields in West Texas. So do your homework, show up at community meetings, make your voice heard, and make a difference at the local to regional scale. Do not neglect that only in favor of federal politics, because real change is already happening right here in Tahoe. It's happening in Nevada. It definitely is happening in California as well. And it's happening because people used their voice. All right. I think that's probably a good place to end, but let's just see if we have any there. Let's see. There we go. Ooh, lots of great questions. Okay, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna do a super quick speed round for 1 minute. Ready? And then we're done. Okay, speed round. Someone on Zoom is advocating for nuclear energy. There is no silver bullet. Did you know that nuclear energy is the most expensive form of electricity? And they had a small modular nuclear reactor plant going in Utah, the first commercial one ever, that just got canceled because it overran its budget. So if nuclear energy was super cheap and we knew what to do with the waste, I would be like, yeah, that's the silver bullet. But unfortunately, it is not. It is one piece of silver buckshot. How do we clarify small actions? By telling stories about how individuals have catalyzed change. And there are plenty of those stories around. Like Glenn, who saw my TED Talk and decided that he was going to have conversations in the city where he lived. In 5 months, he had racked up 10,000 conversations, and the city council had voted for a climate emergency. By the next year, they had put up a £20 million, because it was in England, climate resilience fund. And by the year after that, the entire city was having climate conversations because of one man, Glenn. And lastly, why are certain groups more worried? That would be a much longer conversation, but in a nutshell, people who have already witnessed the impacts on their lives, people who are more aware of how we depend on nature, nature doesn't need us, but we need it, they are often they realize already today, as most of us should, why this matters. So that's often why more people care. And where can you get example talking points? Ooh, I love that question. There, whoops, here we go. Newsletter. That's why I do it. Thank you, everyone. You have been great.
Well, thank you guys all for coming. Thank you all for taking part in this discussion. I'm Jeff Cowan with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, and on behalf of all the co-sponsors, University of Nevada, Reno at Tahoe, University of California, Davis, Tahoe Environmental Research Center, and TRPA, I really want to deeply, deeply thank you for sharing your time, sharing your insights, sharing this amazing information. She's right. Climate change is having cross-cutting impacts to Lake Tahoe, obviously to our planet and to people everywhere.
So we really hope that you will go out, that you will talk to people about your sport, your favorite sports. That was my favorite part with golf and skiing, right? Great ways to talk about it, because she's right, like, we all can help action begin. So thank you again. One more round of applause if I can.
Thank you.